It is absolutely crazy to think that a budget of $300,000 and a painted William Shatner mask created such a huge sensation.
Happy Halloween everyone, I'm ThatGuyMatt, and welcome back to the channel. As it's the month of October, it's finally time for me to delve into the Halloween series. And because so many of you guys have been asking for it, I will oblige. Now, for clarity's sake, I want to mention that I am a fairly newcomer to the series as a whole. I've seen a handful of the entries throughout the years, but this is the first time I've actually watched every entry in chronological order from start to finish. So just know I'm not a long-time fan of the series and that I may get some details wrong from time to time, but I did watch each film numerous times to form my own thoughts and opinions. Regardless, I'd like to know what your thoughts are on the video itself or even the movies in general, so be sure to leave them down below in the comments. One last thing before we begin, I will be discussing each movie at great length, which means that there will obviously be spoilers. I strongly encourage that you watch the movies yourself and then come back here if you so desire. If you don't care at all about spoilers and just want to watch the video, then feel free to continue. With all that said, let's begin. The original Halloween was released in 1978 and was directed by the horror legend himself, John Carpenter, who I know him mostly because of things like They Live, and of course his remake of The Thing, which is often regarded as one of the best horror films ever made. It should go without saying, but the film was groundbreaking for its time, as it helped jump-kick the slasher genre into pop culture status. Granted, there were slashers before Halloween, such as Psycho and 1974's Black Christmas, but ultimately it was John Carpenter's film that really made a huge impact.
Oddly enough, I never actually saw the original Halloween until my late 20s. Like I said, I'm a late bloomer, I know.
So where did we begin? Well, on Halloween night, of all things. 1963 to be specific. We see a young Michael Myers kill his sister Judith Myers, and from there on he is placed in an asylum where he remains for many years to come. And I think what's so surprising about this is that we actually witness Michael kill his first victim when he's just a young innocent child, and I think it really caught everyone off guard, myself included. To see Michael kill at such a young age actually was surprising for me to see, so I knew we were in for a ride going forward. However, 15 years later, he escapes from the mental asylum and heads straight for his hometown of the fictional city of Haddonfield, Illinois, and his whole goal throughout the movie is to stalk and kill anyone that gets in his way. The plot is fairly simple, admittedly, but that's what I think makes it so good in my opinion. So let's get down to some of the characters, of course. Michael Myers, also known as the Shape, is the star of the show. He's a soulless being, and there's no good left in him, and I believe that's what makes him so effective as a killer. The fact that he has no morals and pursues his victims with animal-like instincts makes him so eerie and kinda creepy. He doesn't speak whatsoever, and the only noise he makes are from grunts and breathing. Of course, we also have Dr. Samuel Loomis, played by the late great Donald Pleasence. He's the one with all the knowledge of Michael Myers, as he was his patient for many years, and the way he describes Michael throughout the films makes his presence even more sinister, saying how Michael is the personification of evil, and that he has no humanity left inside of him.
The blackest eyes, the devil's eyes.
It's a great way to describe him to the audience, and while it may come off as telling instead of showing, I think it establishes just how dangerous Michael is before we've even seen him do much. If I were to make any comparisons, it kind of reminds me of how John Wick is described in the first movie. We never actually see him do any action beforehand, but the villains actually do a great job at showcasing just how dangerous he's capable of being before we actually see him actually kill anyone, which I think is a great way to catch the audience off guard. Lastly, there's the babysitter Laurie Strode, played by Jamie Lee Curtis. She's your ordinary girl next door type character. She's helpful, courteous, and tries to be a good role model for the kids that she looks after. Unfortunately, she's also a target for Michael Myers. But thankfully, she has some fight in her, as by the end of the movie she finds all of her friends dead, and this leads to a confrontation between the two. Loomis comes in shortly after and shoots Michael 6 times, and eventually falls off the balcony. But when Loomis goes to confirm that he's actually dead, his body is mysteriously gone. All that can be heard is Michael's breathing in the distance as the theme plays, which leaves it open for a sequel, of course. The kills in this movie are fairly tame, especially for more modern audiences, but I wouldn't say that's necessarily a bad thing. The movie lacks in gore, but it makes up for it with tension. Even still, the movie has some memorable kills, like one of the characters, Bob, for instance, who gets stabbed and is pinned to the wall. If I were to pick any highlights, I love the opening of this movie. I like how it's done in a POV style and is all done in one take. It's really well done, and you can tell that the filmmakers really had to set up all the sequence just for a really good shot. Dr. Loomis and Laurie are very likable in their respective roles, especially Loomis in my opinion. If I were to list any issues I have with the film, they're minimal. minimal, of course, but I do think that some of the dialogue is pretty bad at times. I also find it odd that when Laurie is screaming for help after being chased by Michael, her neighbors flat out ignore her. I get it, it's Halloween night and people play tricks all the time, but is that really a justifiable reason to ignore everything that sounds concerning? Overall, I like the original Halloween quite a bit. The tension throughout is very well done, which makes up for the lack of gore. The characters for the most part are likable, with Loomis stealing the show for me. I admit that I don't have many criticisms and wish I could be more original with what I'm saying here, but I think it's just more difficult as I don't have many issues to begin with. I'm not suggesting that it's a flawless film, mind you, but I think the problems that it does have don't overstay their welcome. Regardless, let's move on to the next one. With the success of Halloween and its cliffhanger ending, a sequel was inevitable. So 3 years later, we would get Halloween 2, which picks up right after the events of the first movie. Laurie is taken to the hospital to be treated for her injuries, while Dr. Loomis and Sheriff Brackett continue their hunt for the boogeyman, Michael Myers. However, it isn't long before Michael makes his way to the hospital to find Laurie and finish off what he started. I have fond memories of Halloween 2, as it actually was the first one I ever saw. I remember when I was around 12 or 13 years old, my dad took me out for the day to do whatever I wanted. I asked to go to Blockbuster, and he told me to pick out any movie of my choice. I wanted to watch the original Halloween, but they didn't have it in stock, so instead I went with the sequel, which was actually available at the time. I admit that while I do like Halloween 2, it isn't my favorite in the series, though I do actually have some nostalgia for it, if anything. For starters, it actually does bring a few things to the table. For starters, I like that the gore is actually amped up a lot more than its predecessor. While it's still tame for modern standards, it definitely has some standout kills. A nurse has her head repeatedly dunked in boiling hot water, and not to mention she's being drowned in the process. The makeup alone is really, really good. Seeing her skin slowly peel away was enough to make me cringe as a kid. For better or worse, this kill definitely had an impact on me, as it was the main thing I remember from this movie when I was a kid. The only thing that beats it out, in my opinion, is actually the scene from Sleepaway Camp when the main cook has a pot of water poured all over his body, and you actually get to see his skin bubble. It's really hard to watch. Nick Castle, the original Michael Myers actor, did not return, so instead he was played by stuntman Dick Warlock, and I think he is a fine Michael Myers, though I do actually have to point out a few flaws with his performance. For one, I think that his walk is kind of robotic and stiff, and secondly, his mask looks more stretched out than it did in the first film. This is most likely due to the fact that the actor just simply has a wider face than Nick Castle did. The mask also looks a little bit more aged and kinda has a weird hue to it, but I think it's because it was rumored that Deborah Hill, one of the producers and writers, kept the mask underneath her bed after they finished filming the first film. She apparently smoked a whole lot too, which explains the differences in the mask's quality and color. It's not a huge deal, but it was definitely noticeable. And if anything, it actually shows how good that original mask actually was, since they wanted to reuse it.
I just wish the quality of masks were more consistent throughout each film. But that being said, this won't be the last time I talk about them, so maybe at some point I might rank the masks, who knows. If you want to see that, just let me know down in the comments below.
With that out of the way, I have to point out a major addition that I mixed on. The big reveal towards the third act, that Laurie is in fact Michael's biological sister. When Michael committed his murder as a child, his sister was taken away and put up for adoption, and eventually she was adopted by the Strodes, hoping that it would be enough for Michael to never find her. I really don't know how I feel about this reveal. On one hand, it gives the killer some motivation, which is nice, but at the same time it sort of feels tacked on. They casually just mention it during an exposition dump, and it just feels like there's no build-up to it. Maybe in hindsight it's probably not that important. If anything, it still makes Michael terrifying, at least. Just the idea that he's pursuing Laurie is scary enough.
Now, I just really hope that we don't get an explanation for Michael's evil in the future. Oh shit.
Now it's time for the ending. Spoilers ahead, so proceed with caution. Loomis eventually finds Laurie at the hospital, and the two take on Michael themselves. Loomis goes to shoot Michael, but is stabbed shortly after. Laurie instead takes the gun herself and shoots him in the eyes, blinding him. It's not exactly what I would call a satisfying fight. Regardless, Laurie escapes from the hospital room, and Loomis shoots one of the CO2 tanks, causing them to explode, killing the two in the process. The movie ends with Michael's body burning, signifying his closure. Halloween 2 is a fairly conventional sequel, which is neither good nor bad. It's a direct continuation that gives more closure to the audience if they wish to seek it out. It adds new things to the mythos while managing to amp up the gore, which is also a nice touch. As for the rest of the film, it's just okay in all honesty. It does manage to be the most consistent in tone with the first film, so it definitely got that right. I have to admit that while I was happy returning to Halloween 2, it is kind of a step down from the original overall in my opinion. The original had less gore and some of the dialogue was pretty cringy, and it can be slow in some areas, but it has a level of charm that's hard to match. Overall, Halloween 2 is a pretty decent follow-up to the original, and I think that's the best thing I can say about it. Halloween 3, Season of the Witch. A film that's often considered the black sheep of the series. At the time, Michael was officially killed off in Halloween 2, so the filmmakers decided to take the series in a different direction, more specifically an anthology approach, which I personally thought would have been an interesting angle to go with. One of the biggest criticisms I see all the time for this movie is that Michael Myers is not present, unless you count the scene that features a trailer from the original Halloween, and I can see where people are coming from. If I were to give an anecdotal example, when I was a child, I was a huge fan of the Friday the 13th series. So when I saw Part 5 in Jason Goes to Hell, Jason Voorhees taking a backseat was very jarring for me, so I'm sure the sentiment was similar in nature when the Season of the Witch was first released. With all that said, I find the disdain for this movie to be somewhat misguided. Now, yes, Michael's presence, or lack thereof, can be disappointing for some, but if you take this movie on its own merit, I think it's actually a pretty solid film to watch around the Halloween season. Granted, it's not a perfect film, but it does make me wonder what the potential could have been had they continued down this direction. After the murder of Ellie's father, the two discover that a mask maker by the name of Colonel Cochran, played by Daniel O'Harely, is planning a Halloween mass murder of millions of children by utilizing Halloween masks in a widespread commercial.
And assuming that he actually went through with his plans, this has to be one of the highest body counts I've ever seen in a slasher film. There's no telling just how many children he actually did kill with this plan.
Some of the gore is off-screen and is only implied at times, but what we do see is actually rather disturbing. For example, there's actually a sequence early on in the film where we witness a character trying to remove a chip from one of the masks, but the chip malfunctions and she is killed, and the aftermath is pretty horrifying to look at. So if nothing else, the actual practical effects of this movie are also really top-notch, which I feel is also an underrated aspect of this movie. Another thing that I like about this movie is actually the soundtrack, which was composed once again by John Carpenter. The movie doesn't have a central theme per se, at least not right away. I could see certain tracks being more memorable than others, however one track that you will not forget is the Shamrock commercial theme. This thing will get stuck in your head, at least it did for me. For some people it might drive them crazy, but for me it's actually catchy and I can't help but love it. And that's another underrated aspect of this film for me. It's heavily commercialized, just like Halloween is a holiday. The costumes, the candy, the decorations, even though it's one of my favorite holidays, it's definitely become a product in a way. And that's what makes Colonel Cochran such a sadistic villain. He wants to use Halloween against the people who celebrate it. He gets them all excited and encourages everyone to wear his masks. And then boom. The ending to this movie is one of the most haunting I've ever seen. Daniel manages to defeat Cochran, but that hasn't stopped the commercial from airing, and you never know if he was actually able to shut it off just in time. Hearing him scream as the movie fades to black definitely gives me goosebumps, even though I've seen this movie a handful of times now. It's definitely up there with Halloween 4 for one of my favorite endings in the series. Like I said earlier, even though I do love this movie and I think it's way too hated, there are aspects that I don't like. This might seem nitpicky, but one of them is actually Daniel. The actor himself actually is pretty good, but some of the writing is questionable for him. In the beginning of the movie, it's established that Daniel is a father of 2 kids but is divorced, but it seems like he's wanting to hook up with just about every woman in this movie. When he's at work, he hits on 2 of his colleagues and eventually forms a relationship with Ellie, which is fun I suppose. I guess it was just kind of funny how he seems like a ladies' man. Lastly, I do think that some of the sections of the movie can drag, especially when Daniel and Ellie first arrive in Shamrock Village. I appreciate a slow build-up in a horror movie, but even I'm willing to admit that a few minutes of runtime could be cut back, and I think it would have made the movie a little bit better. So yeah, overall, I think Season of the Witch actually is a pretty solid Halloween film. I love the atmosphere, the music, the villain is pretty solid, and it does feature 2 likable leads. I know many people will simply hate this film due to a lack of Michael Myers, but I encourage you to give it a second chance and watch it on its own merits. Is it a perfect film? No. Is it a bad Halloween film? That's debatable. I think if they just called the movie Season of the Witch, maybe its reception would have been better. But at the same time, this was John Carpenter's idea for pushing the series forward, and I can respect his attempt at starting something new, even if it wasn't received well. While I may not revisit this one as often as some of the other films, I do like this film for what it is. After the critical and financial failure of Halloween 3, the producers urged that they bring Michael back. So, that's exactly what we got. Halloween 4, The Return of Michael Myers. Taking place 10 years after Michael's reign of terror on Haddonfield, he returns home to kill off the last remaining member of his family. Even though I liked the anthology angle in Halloween 3, I do admit that Halloween 4 actually is one of the highlights in the series for me. In fact, it's the first entry in what is known as the Thorn Trilogy by fans. What does this mean exactly? Well, we'll get into it later on. I gotta build suspense somehow. First, I want to discuss the opening for the film. Of all the openings in the series, this is actually one of my favorites. It's very subdued, and the colors perfectly represent the Halloween aesthetic. And not to mention all the decorations to set the mood. Even the glowing text is a nice touch. As I said earlier, this film introduces some new characters, but also brings back older characters. For starters, we have Donald Pleasance reprising his role as Dr. Samuel Loomis. And I know what you're thinking, last time we saw him, he was killed in the explosion with Michael. But no, he survived somehow. His face is just badly burned and he now uses a cane. Sarcasm aside, I do like Donald Pleasance's performance in this movie. In fact, it's probably my favorite version of Loomis since the first two films. We also have some new characters, with our main one being Jamie Lloyd, played by a young Danielle Harris, who would later go on to star in many horror films going forward, cementing her status as a scream queen. In this film, she is the daughter of Laurie Strode, whom she and her husband died from a car accident years back, and as a result, she was orphaned and eventually adopted by the Caruthers family. Another highlight of this movie is Jamie's older sister Rachel, played by Ellie Cornell. Admittedly, she does start out somewhat selfish, but she quickly turns into a likable character, as she desperately tries to protect Jamie from Michael later on. The actor for Michael was played by George P. Wilbur, and with few exceptions, I think he actually plays a pretty good Michael Myers here. Though admittedly, I do prefer his performance in Curse of Michael Myers, but we'll get to that later on. He's much taller and more hulking than in Part 2, making him a force to be reckoned with. Since he's been in the hospital for over 10 years, he doesn't have his iconic Myers mask just yet. Instead, he starts out with a bandaged look due to his burnt skin from Halloween 2, which I gotta say actually is a pretty cool look for him. That said, I do feel some things fall flat for me. For starters, I really do dislike his mask in this movie. It looks too blank, and it makes him look kind of silly. Seriously, the mask in this film looks nothing like it does in the cover, but if they were to advertise what it actually would look like, then maybe it would be a turnoff for some. Complaints aside, I do think that Wilbur's performance as Michael Myers actually was pretty good, so kudos to him. One thing I love about Halloween 4 is that the kills are ramped up a bit more this time around. Some of my favorites include the guy getting electrocuted, and of course, the girl who gets stabbed with a fucking shotgun. The first time I saw this, I was expecting Michael to shoot her, but no, he just rams it through his victim like a spear. Pretty over the top, sure, but it did make me laugh, and it's definitely a highlight. On the topic of kills, I like how Michael takes out his victims. He starts by killing a guy in charge of the power, leaving everyone in the dark. Then he takes out the police, which makes Jamie and Rachel more vulnerable as a result. This might seem kind of like a small point, but I think this actually makes Michael much more sinister and evil, because he's carefully and selectively choosing the victims he goes for first. And this is something that I feel like we don't see very often in the future films, which I think is actually kind of disappointing. The final confrontation with Michael is pretty satisfying. He's shot by numerous officers and falls into a ditch, presumably killing him for good. Although all of us Halloween fans know that this is not going to kill him off. Jamie and Rachel finally make it back home safe and sound. However, there's a sinister amount of music that plays, and we see a POV shot, and it's revealed to be that Jamie killed her mother, and the movie ends with Loomis shocked and heartbroken, knowing that Jamie has become the very thing that he swore to protect her from. I know for some the ending comes out of left field, and some people might even hate the direction that it was going to go in originally, but I personally like it. It's bold, and I like when filmmakers take a chance, even if it doesn't always pay off. With that said, I do have my issues with the film. Besides the mask, obviously, I think the way that Michael is brought back is kinda stupid. When the explosion went off in Halloween 2, neither Michael nor Loomis were killed, which is a really big stretch, but that's not actually what bothers me the most. What does annoy me is the explanation that we get. Michael never actually died to begin with, he just went into a coma for 10 years and then suddenly just woke up after finding out that he's being transported. I don't really know how being set on fire results in a coma, but whatever. Secondly, it's the weird psychic connection between Michael and Jamie. Granted, this issue gets way worse in Part 5, but it's established here, so I wanted to talk about it. For the majority of Jamie's life, she's never even met her uncle. She knows of him due to his past, but it's weird how she randomly sees him in her dreams. Regardless, the issues here don't take away from the big picture. As it stands right now, this could change in the future, but I think Halloween 4 overall is pretty solid and is easily one of my favorite entries in the series as a whole. It's got a cast of likable characters, a promising Michael performance, pretty gruesome kills, and an ending that leaves you in shock. Some things don't make sense, and I feel that Michael's return was nonsensical, but I still love this movie as a whole. Unfortunately, however, the same can't be said for the next one, because it's where I feel things take a bad turn in quality.
Oh no, we've made it to this one.
Halloween 4 was a pretty good return to form. Michael Myers was back, we got introduced to new characters, with older ones making a comeback, and its cliffhanger ending set up some great expectations that I was personally excited for. Even if Halloween 4 never had a sequel to begin with and just ended the way that it did, it was still haunting either way you look at it. So why is it that I find Halloween 5: The Revenge of Michael Myers to be not only a complete misfire, but a disappointing sequel compared to its previous entry? Well, for starters, let's get the synopsis out of the way. It's been roughly 1 year after the events of Halloween 4, and Michael is nowhere to be seen. Jamie and Rachel have been attempting to move on with their lives, but it isn't long before Michael Myers returns to seek revenge and kill Jamie once and for all. Now, I'm going to be blunt and just say this outright, and I do apologize if I upset any loyal fans of this movie, I hate Halloween 5. I didn't discuss it much in my Halloween 4 review, but this is the second entry in the Thorn trilogy, and for me, it's the worst one. Yes, The Curse of Michael Myers makes some bold moves that I do not like whatsoever, and I will explain when I get to it. For me, Halloween 5 is one of the most boring and nonsensical entries in the entire series. For starters, let's talk about the characters. Jamie is no longer possessed by the evil Michael allegedly transferred to her at the end of Halloween 4. Not only that, but her mother didn't die. She was simply stabbed a whole bunch, and all this resulted was Jamie being sent to a correctional facility for children. And worst of all, she's now a mute for some reason.
I didn't think it was possible to make a beloved character even less compelling than they were before, but they did it.
Why is this so frustrating to me? It's for one big reason. The writers flat out ignore the events of Halloween 4 and have Michael back front and center. If that wasn't odd enough, the ending of Halloween 4 has just been completely abandoned. Large part due to the fact that the film came out exactly 1 year after the previous one. Whether it was time constraints or lack of preparation, I have no idea, but either way, it's frustrating to see this. I was really curious to see what they would do with Jamie's character and was disappointed by the results. I know that some might argue it'd be disturbing to see a child killer take over the series, but let's not forget that Michael did the exact same thing as a kid in the original film. Next up we have Rachel. Now, I personally liked her quite a bit in Halloween 4, and I actually do consider her to be one of the best final girls in any slasher film I've seen. But seeing how she gets treated in this movie is insulting. If you liked her character, I hope you didn't get too attached because she's killed off so unconventionally in the first 20 minutes.
If that isn't one of the biggest fuck you moments to any fan of that character, then I don't know what it is.
So once you swallow that pill, we now have a new set of characters, most notably Rachel's friend, Tina. Now, I want to be clear, I have no disdain for the actress who portrays Tina. For all I know, she's probably a sweetheart in real life. And it's very likely the script was written for her to be this way, but I don't care for this character whatsoever. She may not be the most annoying slasher character I've ever seen, but she and her friends are constantly joking around, popping out at each other, creating false tension, and the entire time they were on screen, I was begging for Michael to come along and hack them up. I think the reason that I dislike them so much is because they end up taking up more screen time than Rachel and Jamie. You know, the two characters that I care way more about. Another odd choice is that the writing sometimes comes off as oddly funny and doesn't take itself very seriously. For example, in this movie we have the stereotypical goofy cops, who are so over the top that they have their own music to accompany their shenanigans.
What were they thinking?
Another addition to the mythos is that throughout the film there's a man walking around with a trench coat and black boots, which admittedly makes you curious, but shocker, we won't get an answer for this until the next film. Next, there's Dr. Loomis, played once again by Donald Pleasance, and this is yet again another aspect of the film that I actually don't like. I hate what they did to Loomis in this movie. Despite having a couple of standout moments and some memorable lines, he's an unlikable dick in this movie. While Jamie is in the hospital, Loomis visits her to get any info on Michael's whereabouts. And you'd think after having one of her episodes where she sees Michael and is having a panic attack, he'd calmly ask her, but no, he instead shoves around hospital equipment, tempts her with guilt of hurting her mother, and even uses her as bait during the climax just to get to Michael. Now look, I get it. Loomis has dealt with Michael long enough, and at this point, he'll do just about anything to stop him. But even still, it's not really a great excuse for why he acts the way he does in this movie. The way he's portrayed makes me think that I should fear him and not Michael. The actor for Michael Myers this time around was done by Don Shanks, and I really am mixed on his interpretation as a whole. It's not as stiff as Dick Warlock was in Halloween 2, but ultimately he doesn't bring a whole lot to the table. It doesn't help that he has one of the worst masks in the entire franchise, which is ironic since it's supposed to be the same mask from Halloween 4, and it looks nothing like it. If that wasn't bad enough, he puts on an entirely different one about halfway through the movie, which is somehow even worse.
Just when I thought that Michael couldn't be embarrassed any further. Oh yeah.
Point being is that I feel Michael was a lot less intimidating and intelligent than he was in Halloween 4. In that movie, he strategically took out people that were important so he can get to Rachel and Jamie. In Halloween 5, he just feels derivative of previous iterations, and not really in a good way. Like I said, this movie was rushed into development shortly after Halloween 4, so there's a good chance that he probably just didn't get to experiment as much as he wanted to with the character. Lastly, let's discuss the ending. Michael is finally apprehended and put in a jail cell, where the officers explain that he'll remain there until his death. Which, admittedly, is a pretty haunting notion. However, the trenchcoat guy comes along and shoots up the police station and frees Michael from his imprisonment, which obviously will set it up for a sequel. So yeah, I don't like Halloween 5 at all. It ruins developments made in Halloween 4, the characters are less compelling, and even annoying at times. The movie is just boring in all honesty. If I were to point out anything the movie did well, I think the look and feel of the setting is pretty good. It does feel like Halloween, and I like that some of the kills incorporate harvesting tools like hay rakes and scythes. But beyond that, I find it difficult to praise this movie. Compared to Halloween 4, it's just disappointing, convoluted, and frustrating. With all that said, it's not the worst slasher I've ever seen. It's just a bad entry for the Halloween series in particular, at least for me anyway. If you enjoyed, I'm glad you do. With all that said, let's jump into the next installment and see how the filmmakers finally cap off the Thorn trilogy a whopping 6 years later. Before I even begin, I have one question. Why did they stop numbering the films going forward? It's always weird how film series tend to do this, as if it's tacky to do so. For example, the Rocky films were numbered all the way from 1 to 5, and then they came out with Rocky Balboa. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love that film, but it's just weird how they too stopped numbering the entries.
Wow, here I am talking about the Halloween movies, and yet I've somehow managed to get off topic once again. Good job, Matthew. Keep it up.
So, Halloween: The Curse of Michael Myers. After the mess that was Halloween 5, what could they possibly have in store for us this time around? Especially with the cliffhanger of an ending. Well, it's unfortunate to say this, but despite being a better entry than 5 overall, this film still manages to frustrate me. The Curse of Michael Myers does actually do a lot of things right, but it also manages to mess up so many crucial things as well. So let's start off with the plot. It's been several years since the previous events, and Jamie has been kidnapped by the same cult that kidnapped Michael Myers. She's pregnant in this movie, and they are waiting for the arrival of her baby. I'll explain the cult in more detail as we go on, but for right now I want to kind of keep it minimal so that way we can go along at the same time. With the help of a rogue member, Jamie and her baby escape the grasp of the cult, but Michael chases after them. And what's unfortunate is that after getting her baby to safety, Jamie is gruesomely killed by impalement. It's kind of a damn shame, considering that she actually was one of my favorite characters in the previous 2 films. Admittedly, I'm not as upset by this as I should be, but I kind of expected her to be killed off sooner or later, and while it may not be as unceremonious as Rachel's death, it's still a gut-wrencher. You may have noticed that Jamie is not portrayed by Danielle Harris this time. According to reports, she was offered even less money than her previous work on Halloween 4 and 5, and I imagine in tandem with the script, she promptly said no.
Honestly, I don't blame her. If she feels like her worth is a lot more than what she was being offered, then yeah, I would say that her decision was actually justified.
With that out of the way, we head back over to Haddonfield, and we see the Strode family who are living in the Myers house. I have to assume because they can't sell it. Which is kind of ridiculous if we're being honest. I don't care if the house was hard to sell or not. The history associated with it would make me steer clear of it. The Strode family as a whole are underwhelming. They're not all bad, well maybe with the exception of one character in particular, but as a whole they don't really stand out. John Strode, who's the father, is one of the most despicable characters in any slasher film I've seen. He's an alcoholic that hits his kids on a frequent basis. Not a fan of him at all. But hey, at least now I know what to expect from the script. We get an appearance from Paul Rudd, who plays a now grown-up Tommy from the original film, and it's sad to say that even he's not that great. Every line out of his mouth feels so monotone and weird. The first time we were introduced to him, he's gandering at one of the Strode members as they change clothes, so he instantly comes off as a creep. It's kind of a shame as I like the actor quite a bit, but he's really underwhelming in this film. Thankfully, however, we do at least get Donald Pleasence back as Dr. Loomis, which would be his final appearance as the character before eventually passing away. I think he's fine in the movie. His performance may come off as tiring at times, but I think it actually works here. He's retired in this movie, and wants to move on from constantly chasing Michael, and I think it's fitting for him. Of course, we also have Michael, played once again by George P. Wilbur, who I feel did a better job at playing the character than he did in Halloween 4. Not to mention, they did it. They finally made a good mask. It's not perfect, but this is arguably the best looking mask since the original film. It's just kind of a shame that it took this many installments to get right, let alone in one that I'm mixed on, but hey, credit where credit is due. George Wilbur ramps up Michael's intimidation in this movie, and I think it's all the better for it. The kills are also some of the better ones in the entire series. If I were to name my favorite, it would easily go to John Strode. His death is just simply awesome, albeit very over the top. He's violently electrocuted in this movie, and depending on the cut of the movie you see, his head actually explodes. One last positive I'll mention is that I do feel the atmosphere for this film was actually pretty good. Of course it has all the decorations and whatnot, but even the lighting really adds to it. It has a very subdued autumn color palette, which I think is actually a really nice touch. So with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and get into the bullshit. Now again, this film overall is pretty mixed for me. But one thing I am not mixed on, however, is what they do with the Thorn cult that was built up from Halloween 5. If you recall from that movie, there were instances where we saw a cloaked figure who eventually freed Michael from his imprisonment. Well, would you be surprised if I told you that it was this guy? His name is Dr. Terrence Wynn, one of Loomis's colleagues. Now you might be wondering, what is his involvement and why is he running this cult? It turns out that when Michael was a kid, Dr. Wynn put a curse on him. This curse obviously is what made him evil, and of course the whole point of it is that it actually is supposed to make you kill your own bloodline in order to please the gods of the cult or something? I don't know. The point is that we now have a definitive reason why Michael kills people, and more specifically why he's targeting his family. Let me be frank about this. I do not like this at all. This, for me anyway, ruins the mystery and intrigue behind Michael Myers as a villain. Okay, I can accept that he's essentially being mind-controlled, but that doesn't exactly explain how he's practically immortal. Does the curse give him immortality? Does it make him invincible? I mean, they don't really explain it very well. Even if you look past that, part of the charm was never knowing anything, and I feel in this case, the less we know, the better. All this really does is make me feel sorry for Michael, since he basically was a victim of circumstance, and it makes the cult way more evil than he ever was. Sure, Michael killed countless people throughout the entire series, but he was being controlled and manipulated the entire time, which if you ask me makes the cult far worse in comparison. Now, I know some will point to the producer's cut and say that it explains the cult in greater detail, but I don't want to divulge too much as I feel both versions of the movie are pretty flawed. In fact, the producer's cut adds even more layers that I didn't need. For example, you as an audience member might be wondering, who impregnated Jamie? Was it one of the cult members? Maybe Dr. Wynn? No, in fact, you're never actually going to believe this, but the actual father is Michael Myers. Yes, the cult made him rape his own niece, and as a result, he had a baby with Jamie. I refuse to elaborate any further. Seriously, this gives me goosebumps just reading it from my notes. I could go on and on, but I think you get my point. The Curse of Michael Myers is a very flawed sequel, and no matter what version I watch, it just leaves me more frustrated because what it does well, it does very well. But for me, the negatives far outweigh the positives here. It has a decent lineup of kills, a good atmosphere, and a good Myers portrayal, but literally everything else falls flat for me. So with that out of the way, let's finally delve into a sequel that managed to revive my love for the series once more. Halloween: The Curse of Michael Myers was a mixed bag for many fans, myself included. Instead of continuing the same timeline, however, the filmmakers decided to go with a reboot of sorts. Set 20 years after the events of the original Halloween 1 and 2, we got Halloween H20, or H2O.
In case I am wrong, I'm just going to go ahead and refer to it as H20 so that way I don't sound like a complete idiot throughout.
H20's plot follows the return of Laurie Strode, though she's actually not referred to as such. She faked her own death, changed her name to Carrie Tate, lives in California, and is now the headmistress of a school. She has a son named John that lives with her and is now divorced. Laurie is simply just trying to move on from the events, but she fears that Michael is still out there waiting for the chance to strike again. And on Halloween night, he finds Laurie and the two have one final showdown to see who will come out on top. I'm just going to go ahead and spoil the review by saying this. I absolutely love H20. It's probably in my top 5 sequels for this entire franchise. It's not perfect, mind you. In fact, there are quite a few issues I actually have with the film, all of which I'll delve into later on, but for what it is, I like the direction the sequel takes. It's one of the earliest legacy sequels I can think of in slasher series. For those that don't know what I mean when I say legacy sequel, it's basically a term that's used to describe a sequel that takes place much further in the timeline, but erases a lot of the movies from that timeline. Sort of how Halloween 2018 is a direct sequel to the original, but ignores everything that comes afterwards. It's confusing, I know, but that's to be expected with the series as a whole. Starting off with the positives, let's go ahead and get the obvious out of the way. Jamie Lee Curtis making a return. She's a lot more complex now due to the events of the original. Laurie isn't this pristine, cute schoolgirl anymore. She's now a lone mother trying to provide for her son, all while she's battling her inner demons. Her trauma is believable, and I get why she's overprotective of her son John, despite his annoyance. I really can't say much more than that. I just like her performance in this movie, and I think that her return actually is very much warranted. Her son John is played by a very young Josh Hartnett, which is cool to see. I love him in things like 30 Days of Night and some of his indie films like 40 Days, 40 Nights. While his acting is pretty good overall, I do wish we actually would have gotten to know him just a little bit better. All we really know about him is that he has a girlfriend, and he can be rebellious at times to avoid his mother's protection. Not a bad character per se, but I just wish we had a little bit more from him. We also get an appearance from LL Cool J, who plays a security guard at the school. He tends to play fairly comedic roles in a lot of these horror films, and this one is no exception. Throughout the entire runtime, he's trying to convince his wife that he's capable of writing romance novels. Admittedly, some of the dialogue can be pretty cringy, but he manages to pull it off, just like how he did in Deep Blue Sea, which is another film that I've reviewed on this channel. Another character I thought was worth mentioning was Norma Watson, played by Janet Leigh, who, if you didn't know, is actually Jamie Lee Curtis's mother. She's famous for playing Marion Crane in Psycho, which this movie makes a clear reference to when Norma goes back to her car, which happens to be a 1957 Ford Custom. This doesn't really add a whole lot to the plot per se, but is a nice nod to another popular horror film. Lastly, we have Michael Myers himself, played this time by Chris Duran. Now, I will explain in great detail later on, but for right now I'll just say that his version of Michael is a mixed bag. When it comes to positives for H20, I think one of the best things it does is capitalize on its tension throughout. We know that Michael is out there, evident by the first 15 minutes, so it's just a matter of waiting for him to return. That being said, I also do like the little moments where Laurie is actually having visions of Michael when he actually isn't there. It just shows how traumatized she is by him. The kills this time around are not exactly what I would say are the best ones, but that being said, there are a few gnarly ones that I can point out. The one that sticks out to me the most is actually John's friend, who gets her leg broken on a dumbwaiter, then she's brutally stabbed afterwards. Simplistic, but I do like it nonetheless. Of course, the showdown between Laurie and Michael is very exhilarating. At first, Laurie's main focus is getting John off campus to ensure his safety, but after that, it's an all-out brawl. Even when she assumes that Michael is dead, she drives off with his body and makes sure to finish the job. She crashes the van, and Michael flies through the windshield. Laurie finally has the advantage as she gets him pinned between a tree limb and the van itself, which gives her the perfect opportunity to finish him off. But in an oddly touching moment, Michael reaches his hand out to Laurie, and she initially starts to go for it, but she ends up cutting off his head instead. Damn, if that doesn't kill him, I don't know what will. And one of the best parts about this movie is that you can tell it actually feels like a legacy sequel, because it actually ends with the original Halloween theme playing in the background. Even though I do love H20 as a whole, this movie does unfortunately have a few glaring issues that hold it back from being really great in my opinion. For starters, there's absolutely no explanation for Michael appearing out of nowhere after all this time. The last time we saw him, he was being burned alive and was presumed to be dead. As much as I don't like him waking up from a coma in Halloween 4, that at least explains why it took him so long to come back. It's not a great explanation, and is rather silly when you think about it, but at least it was something. In H20, it's just simply, oh, Michael's back now.
I don't get it. Was he hiding all this time? If that is the case, then why did it take him 20 years exactly to find Laurie? It just seems kind of coincidental.
Another nitpick is that I feel this movie is lacking the actual Halloween atmosphere. Sure, there are decorations scattered throughout and the characters are talking about the holiday, but it really doesn't capture that feeling. Even films like Halloween 5 and 6, as much as I dislike them for the most part, even those manage to have a better Halloween atmosphere than this one does. It's not a huge negative, mind you, but it would have been nice to see a bit more utilization of the holiday in general. I don't know, maybe they couldn't afford that many decorations, and they probably had to use a majority of the budget on all of Michael's masks. Alright, this is a big one, the masks throughout H20, and I'm sure many of you are waiting for this, but for those of you who don't know, let me elaborate. H20 has a total of 4 different masks that are used throughout the film. Instead of talking about them all individually, let me focus on one in particular, which is the CGI mask. This thing looks flat out terrible, and if this is your first time seeing it, I'm sorry for making you aware of it. Once you notice it, it's hard to unsee it. There's really no excuse for this, it just looks awful. Now, allegedly, at some point during the production, the mask was either lost or they just couldn't find it, or someone couldn't be bothered to go and pick it out from the trailer or something. I have no idea. They instead went back and filmed this one little sequence where someone plastered the mask over his face with CGI, and it just looks so bad. This is like one of the most inexcusable things I've ever seen in a horror film. With all that said, even the main Myers mask that we see throughout the film isn't that great either. The hair looks okay as it's kind of frizzy and not very swept back. Some of the facial features are alright, but what sticks out for me are actually the eyes. I mean literally, they are damn near sticking outside of his mask. To some this may not be a big deal, but to me it's actually serious. Michael's mask is a crucial element to the films, and not just thematically, but also for scare factor. Seeing directly into his eyes takes away from how scary and soulless he really is. Now it just looks like a guy that has a really tight mask on his head. The bottom line is that all the masks throughout this film are flawed for one reason or the other. The only mask I like is the one seen briefly in the first 20 minutes when Michael is about to kill the nurse from the first movie. The mask was supposedly a duplicate of the Curse of Michael Myers mask, which by all accounts I think is a good look for him. But they decided to change it out while shooting because they didn't want the audience to think it was a direct continuation of Curse. Which is fair enough, but I really don't think it justifies using a worse mask if you ask me. So overall, despite its many glaring flaws, I still enjoy H20. I feel the atmosphere could have been handled a bit better with more of an emphasis on the holiday. Some of the characters aren't as interesting, and the lack of explanation for Michael's return is a bit jarring, but if you look all past that, I think this movie is actually well done and sets out to give a pretty kick-ass battle between Laurie and Michael. It's a good sequel despite its flaws, and it remains to be one of my personal favorites.
If only it had ended there. If only. Let's get this shit over with.
Now, is it just me, or is the subtitle Resurrection used way too much? Seriously, Alien Resurrection, The Matrix Resurrections, Hellraiser Resurrection. So, we've finally made it. Halloween Resurrection. The worst entry in the entire Halloween film series, in my opinion. Yes, worse than Halloween 5, 6, the 2 Rob Zombie films, and even the new trilogy. While all those films I've mentioned have their own issues, I still believe Resurrection is easily the worst one. If you enjoy Resurrection for whatever reason, that's great. I'm glad you do. But just know this will definitely be more critical than my previous reviews. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and get into it. This film was directed by Rick Rosenthal.
Wait, whoa, hold on a second. Rick Rosenthal directed this movie. The same guy that directed Halloween 2?
What the fuck happened?
Just take it easy, Matt. We've just started.
Generic and overused subtitle aside, what is the plot of Resurrection? Well, it takes place 3 years after the events of H20. Even though Michael's head was cut clean off, he's somehow alive and ready to continue his murder spree in Haddonfield. This time around, we follow a group of kids who spend the night in the Myers house to record their POVs in order to gain internet fame and notoriety. But as if anyone didn't see this coming from a goddamn light year off, Michael Myers returns to protect his home.
So he's just Leatherface now?
Unbeknownst to me at the time, this commits a cardinal sin and fucks up the previous movie. Kind of like Halloween 5 took everything that happened in Halloween 4 and just threw it in the trash, lit it on fire, and then pissed on it. So let's go ahead and start with the beginning. As I stated previously, this movie takes place 3 years after age 20, and Laurie is now a patient in a psych ward. But you might be asking, how did she end up there in the first place? This might be a bit complex, so hopefully you can follow along with me, but it turns out that the climax of H20 was not between Michael and Laurie as we were led to believe. During the events of that movie, when Michael was seemingly defeated, some paramedics showed up to claim Michael's body. But at some point, Michael just randomly wakes up and crushes the guy's larynx, they swap out each other's clothes, and then Michael runs off into the woods somewhere. So that entire showdown wasn't even true, and Laurie just killed some random person, which made her have a breakdown, and she was committed to the hospital as a result. Now, let me just go ahead and say this right now. I'm a big fan of horror, right? Throughout many years, I have seen some incredibly stupid ways for a horror character to be revived. Let's go ahead and take the Leprechaun series for instance, right? In one of the films, the Leprechaun is blown up early on in the movie, and a guy pisses on his corpse. However, during that, the Leprechaun shoots up the guy's piss hole and eventually explodes out of the guy's penis. In Nightmare on Elm Street, Freddy Krueger is revived from a dog's piss puddle. Now, the point is that I have seen some rather stupid ways for a horror character to be revived, okay? So I mean this with absolute sincerity. This is one of the dumbest excuses I have ever seen for a slasher villain to be revived. Even the previous examples I listed were far more believable than this bullshit. Not only is it illogical, but like I said, it actively makes H20 a worse movie by default because it ruins that ending. Some people might argue and say that a movie can't be made worse by ones that follow it. However, I think this actually is an exception for once. So with that stupid explanation out of the way, Michael finally makes his way through the psych ward to finally kill off Laurie. And he's not exactly subtle about it this time around, as he kills all the guards and even breaks through her fucking door to get to her.
Now keep this in mind because this will be very important in a couple of minutes, I promise you.
It turns out that Laurie tricked Michael as he chases her through the building and eventually the two have a standoff on the roof. But again, Laurie just laid out a trap for him. Michael is now hanging upside down and Laurie begins to taunt him as she cuts the rope. But not before she utters this dumbass line.
I just have to be sure.
With all due respect, Laurie, because I like you as a character, but what the fuck? Michael literally just burst open your fucking door. He literally broke it into 2 pieces. You're still questioning whether or not this is actually him or not? If it's not Michael, then who the fuck is it? So yeah, Laurie stupidly decides to check and see if it's actually Michael Myers. And once she goes to reach for his mask and pull it off, he grabs her, the rope breaks, the two fall over, and Michael stabs and kills Laurie. This is now the 3rd time in the series we've had yet another unceremonious death for a beloved character. Rachel, Jamie, and now Laurie. And what's even more insulting is that the filmmakers only brought Jamie Lee Curtis back so they can kill her off. I don't even have anything more to say. This opening and journal has been nothing but a huge steaming pile of garbage.
And you might be wondering, does the film actually end up getting better from here on out? To an extent.
Once you get past that intro, the rest of the film just turns into a below-average early 2000s slasher film with a bunch of nothing characters. I'm not trying to be rude, and no disrespect to any of the cast, but hardly any of them stand out for one reason or the other. The only one I can remember by name is Freddy, played by Busta Rhymes, but not because he's a good character. He is so annoying in this film, and I was desperately waiting for Michael to come along and finish him off. Let me further explain my point by why I don't like this character. For context, Freddy is the one who orchestrated this whole event for these kids to come in and basically he filmed themselves and this POV to get them internet famous and notoriety, right? Well, expectedly, when they don't capture anything of interest, he decides to put on a Myers mask to scare them. But surprise, surprise, Michael follows closely behind him. But instead of just simply killing him like Michael would in any other fucking movie in this series, he stands there and just gets verbally abused and humiliated by this character. Even going so far as to poke him in the head and tell him to go away.
I said, what you looking at me like that for? Huh? Your shit ain't working up there or something?
And you might be thinking, what does Michael do? Does he fucking stab him? Does he fucking jam his hand through his chest or something like that? No, he does exactly what he's told and leaves the room. I honestly did not think it was possible for you to humiliate Michael any further than you already have, but I guess you managed to do it somehow. The rest of the film is pretty straightforward. The students get picked off one by one, and there is the eventual showdown between the final girl, Freddy, and of course Michael. Not only does Freddy karate kick Michael through the fucking window, but he also fries his nutsack with some jumper cables. And last but not least, as Michael is being burned to death, Freddy issues one last corny line for the audience.
Happy fucking Halloween!
Who wrote this? Seriously, who?
So yeah, some of the crew make it out alive, and the movie ends with Michael's body on an autopsy table. However, Michael opens up his eyes to remind us that he will be back for another installment at some point.
Yeah, fuck you too, Halloween Resurrection. Seriously, what an embarrassment from start to finish.
I'm sure some might think I'm being too harsh in this film, and I do apologize in advance if it comes off that way, but I just do not like this movie whatsoever. Even when you look past the terrible opening and the continuity issues, it really is nothing more than a below-average slasher film. With all that said, are there any redeeming qualities? Yes, though they're few and far between. For one, I do like the idea of the film taking place in the Myers house. While it does overstay its welcome and ultimately turns into a haunted house kind of movie, it was an interesting idea if nothing else. I also like some of the kills. There aren't too many, of course, though obviously all the Halloween films don't exactly have the highest body counts. But I have to say the kills this time around were pretty good. I like the one where the guy gets a tripod through his throat, and Michael also crushes a guy's head at one point, which is pretty gruesome. Some of the actors at least tried to do their best, though I'd argue they only could do so much with this script. But it's unfortunate that I cannot remember a single one of their names, and keep in mind, I've watched this movie twice for this review. I think the POV shtick is at least somewhat interesting of an idea, and they could have done more with it, but ultimately it just comes off as kind of a gimmick. He's played by the actor Brad Laree, and I'd say he did a fairly good job in the role. For starters, the mask is an improvement over the many masks of age 20, but even then it's just okay. But what makes this Michael a mixed bag overall, and this isn't Brad Laree's fault, but Michael just feels like an absolute pushover in this film. In the beginning, he's creeping through the halls of the asylum, taking out his victims left and right. But then he busts through the metal door, and this isn't exactly indicative of how strong he'll be later on. Michael's strength is highlighted here and there, but ultimately when Freddy comes into play, he just turns Michael into a laughingstock, which is something that you should never do in a slasher film, is making your slasher icon a joke. Overall, Halloween Resurrection for me anyway is a pretty awful sequel. I had to sit through this piece of shit twice just to review it, and I hated it more the second time around. Some might look at this film as a guilty pleasure, and hey, that's fair enough if you do, but to me this was just a chore to sit through. Even with its interesting premise, this somehow manages to be one of the most boring Halloween films I've seen. But by far, the worst thing that this movie does is mess up H20's ending. Granted, that movie has its issues that are not related, but it's still a much better movie than this excuse of a sequel. I honestly have nothing else to say. Fuck Resurrection, let's move on to the next one. After the shit show that was Halloween Resurrection, fans and critics alike were not happy. The series would inevitably sit on the shelf for a couple years before eventually being remade in 2007. This time it was directed by singer and filmmaker Rob Zombie, who's best known for The Devil's Rejects and House of a Thousand Corpses, to name a few. Rob Zombie's remake series is tough for me to review, as I feel they do certain things well and others not so much. No matter where you stand on them, they are very polarizing films. You either love them or you hate them. Now, before I actually get into my actual critique of the movies, I want to go ahead and mention that I will be reviewing the theatrical cuts for both Rob Zombie films, though I may discuss the differences between the different versions at times. The reason for this is because I find the theatrical cuts to be a superior way to watch these films, as it trims out a lot of the fluff, but I'll elaborate as we go. I think the biggest problem with both films, unfortunately, is the writing. For starters, the film takes a lot of scenes and dialogue directly from the original Halloween. The reason why I dislike this is simply due to the fact that it's supposed to be a remake, and yet it ends up piggybacking a lot off the original, while also trying to implement new ideas.
He couldn't have. 2 roadblocks and an all-points bulletin wouldn't stop a 5-year-old.
2 roadblocks and an all-points bulletin wouldn't stop a 5-year-old.
The biggest selling point of Rob Zombie's Halloween is that it aims to give Michael a backstory and explain why he became evil in the first place. I'm sure that many will agree, but just like in Curse, this is something that I feel like I just didn't need to know. I find Michael much more effective and terrifying when we know less about him. Even still, I can respect Rob Zombie for trying to do something different, even if I don't care for the direction. We spend nearly 40 minutes of the film developing Michael as a killer, which means by the time we get to characters like Laurie, I don't feel as invested because she's introduced so late into the film. It doesn't help that she acts no different than her friends Annie and Linda. I think it was good that John Carpenter tried to differentiate his characters in the original, even if some of them were one-dimensional. With all that said, I do think Scout Taylor Compton gives it her all. She definitely seems like she could be a capable Laurie Strode, and I believe some of that potential was more noticeable in the sequel, however we'll get to that later on. Of course we can't talk about this movie without mentioning Dr. Loomis, played this time by Malcolm McDowell, an actor that I do actually like. Now, it needs to be stated that I'm not throwing shade at his interpretation of the character, especially compared to Donald Pleasance. But with that said, my biggest issue with his version of Loomis is that he doesn't really showcase just how dangerous Michael is. When Loomis described Michael in the original, you felt his fear and paranoia. You understood how dangerous Michael was. In Rob Zombie's version, however, there isn't that much urgency to his character. I don't hold it against the actor, however, but more so the writing. So overall, Loomis isn't terrible per se, but I wouldn't say that he's as good as he could have been. Michael Myers was portrayed by Tyler Mane this time around, and he's easily one of the most terrifying iterations of the character. Not only is he much taller, but he's much more of a tank this time around. He's constantly breaking through walls and kicks down doors to get to his victims. The gore alone is the most brutal it's ever been, and it's pretty hard to watch. And while I do like this version and find him scary, I have to be honest that it's a bit much for me. This feels more like Jason Voorhees than Michael Myers to me. Like I said, not a bad take on the character, and if anything, Tyler Mane definitely provides a great performance and brings his own flavor to the character. The rest of the cast is fine. We get some horror legends like Brad Dourif and Daniel Harris, who play Sheriff Brackett and Annie Brackett respectively. Even Sherry Moon Zombie, who plays Deborah Myers, is fine in her role, which is good because I usually don't care for her acting in a lot of her films. Now, let's go ahead and get on to some of the mixed and negative aspects of this film. Now, some of you might actually not like what I'm going to say, but I'm going to go ahead and say it anyway. Rob Zombie, as controversial as it might be, is not a terrible director in my opinion. I myself don't care for a lot of his music nor his movies. However, his guerrilla-style directing gives these movies a grimy, gringy look that adds to the atmosphere. That said, his writing, in my opinion, has never been his best work. I mean no exaggeration here that the first 20 minutes of this movie is so bad that I nearly shut it off the first time I tried watching it. It's just filled with each member of the Myers family constantly bickering, throwing insults, and issuing threats towards each other, which I get is supposed to be the setup for Michael's bad home life, but it's so over the top it's honestly laughable at times. Like I said, whether you love him or not, Rob Zombie is capable of actually holding the camera. That being said, I just wish he would hire a better writer, or at least someone tap him on the shoulder from time to time as a creative consultant. So overall, is Halloween 2007 bad? In my opinion, no. It's got good aspects to it, but also a lot of frustrating ones to it. Way too much time is spent on Michael's backstory, which is why I feel Laurie suffers as a character later on. The writing is pretty awful for the most part, and many of the characters featured are more or less just cannon fodder. Overall, it's just okay for me. I wish I could say more about it, but I don't want to sound like a broken record, so let's go ahead and move on. So no longer than 2 years later we would get a sequel to Rob Zombie's Halloween, simply titled Halloween 2. Just like the previous film, the sequel is notorious for being strongly disliked by many Halloween fans. Some people even despise it, saying it's actually one of the worst Halloween films ever made. However, again, for me, I'm somewhere in the middle on it. Just like the previous films, there are aspects of the film I strongly dislike, but at the same time there are things that it does well. In some cases, I actually like this film more than the other one because it actually feels more original than its predecessor. It actually tries to take it in somewhat of a new direction with it focusing on Michael's psyche as a killer. Whether you love the first one or not, it just kind of felt derivative of the original Halloween in a lot of ways, and it added some new things, but ultimately just didn't really feel like it had an identity of its own, except maybe with, Rob Zombie's unique aspects. The plot for Halloween 2 is set 1 year after the events of the first movie. Laurie Strode is now living with her friend Annie Brackett, as the two try to move on from their encounter with Michael Myers. Despite being shot in the head at the end of the previous movie, Michael is far from dead and comes back to Haddonfield to kill Laurie. Whether you love it or hate it, Halloween 2 is arguably more polarizing than the first one. It still features a lot of the same issues I had from the first one, such as the writing and bad dialogue, so instead of repeating myself, I want to focus more on the characters and themes throughout this film. The first film was about exploring Michael's legacy as a killer, whereas this one focuses more on his psyche, and it allows us to see through the eyes of a serial killer, especially as it ties in with his now deceased mother, and how in his mind, she supports supports his killing and murders. Which admittedly is pretty interesting. What can I say, I love psychological horror, so I find this more intriguing than the first Rob Zombie film, though it manages to stumble in a lot of areas. One thing I feel they did improve was Laurie's character overall. She's obviously been traumatized by the events of the first movie, and frankly I can sympathize with her situation, especially when she finds out that she's related to Michael Myers. Last but not least, there's Dr. Loomis, once again played by Malcolm McDowell. And I feel like I'm going to sound like a broken record because I feel like I'm not adding anything new, but I hate what they did to his character in this movie. He's done a full 180 and is now an unlikable douchebag. He became rich after writing about his experience with Michael throughout the years, which isn't necessarily the problem itself. Instead, he seems to only care about the money and his reputation. Not only that, but when he's presented with the idea that Michael may still be out there, he just simply laughs it off and just ignores it. Not to mention he verbally abuses those around him, including his literary agent.
When I want your opinion, I'll beat it out of you.
Okay, seriously, where's Michael at? He's got business to attend to.
Now, Loomis was really unlikable in Halloween 5, but at least there he actually had a reason to be since he was trying to save the townsfolk who didn't always listen to him. So really his performance came off more as tired and actually frustrated than it actually came off as bitter or angry. So going from a sweet and humble doctor to this wisecracking, heartless asshole is really jarring and not what I expected at all from his character. Seriously, both of these films are filled with some of the most despicable people I've ever seen in a slasher film. I'm just saying that of all the characters to become unlikable, I can't believe that they actually made Loomis one. The only interesting caveat I can say about that is that at least it makes him somewhat more of a developed character from his first film counterpart, but even then, why would you want to turn him into such a heartless asshole? It just doesn't make any sense to me. Speaking of Michael, he's once again played by Tyler Mane, and I can't really add much more this time around. He's still intimidating and plays the character very well. Though I have to say I really don't like the look for him in this movie. He kind of just looks like a hobo, and there are times like where he's not wearing his mask and you can clearly see his face, which is something I don't want to see. Also, a little side tangent, but in the director's cut he actually speaks. During the climax he actually says this. Again, I just want to emphasize that if you do plan to watch these movies, please just do yourself a favor and watch the theatrical cut. I know that sometimes the director's cut might actually have more information that makes a movie richer with details, but I implore you, just simply watch the theatrical cut. So with all that said, let's discuss the ending. Ultimately, Michael tries to kill off Laurie, but she gets the upper hand and stabs him to death. Then she's suddenly in a psych ward and sees a vision of her ghost mother walking towards her as she grins. I don't know if I'm reading too much into this, but I have to assume that this is Laurie in the afterlife, especially with how much her mother is brought up as a ghost. I don't know, I could be dead wrong. I don't know if they had plans for a third movie, but it didn't seem to matter as this movie was poorly received by both fans and critics. With all that said, is this movie as bad as some people say it is? That depends on who you're asking. Ultimately, this is a film that leans more into the psychological nature of Michael Myers, and while I do respect that, I can definitely see why it'd be a turnoff for some people. Ultimately, I think I do prefer this movie over its predecessor, even with its shortcomings. Both are very flawed, but I did find myself enjoying this one a lot more. The best thing I can say about this movie is that Rob Zombie at least tried to make it more of a unique sequel, which is commendable and respectable. But ultimately, it's a film that at the same time feels kind of unfocused, and you don't really know what's real and what's not real, with Michael's psyche and whatnot. I think the characters, for the most part, are not as likable as they were before. I think that Laurie gets a little bit more development in this movie, but beyond that, it's a film that I would not revisit as often.
I don't know, I've been recording for so long, so maybe I'm just getting a little bit fatigued, and I might be a bit nicer than usual, and admittedly, I've also been having a few drinks here and there, so I don't know. Either way, let's move on to the next movie, shall we?
It would be 9 years before we saw yet another entry in the Halloween series. With this one, it's simply called Halloween Once Again. That's now 3 for 3. I don't think I've actually ever seen it happen that many times. Despite the title, however, it's actually not a remake. This actually is a direct continuation of the Halloween from 1978, making it a legacy sequel of sorts. We've had other franchises do the exact same, such as Scream and Candyman, for instance. But that isn't always a bad thing, as sometimes a series actually can benefit from having a reboot. For starters, the film takes a few pages out of age 20 in that it follows a similar structure. For one, we have Jamie Lee Curtis back as Laurie Strode, and she is now a grandmother. It's now obviously been 40 years since the events of the first movie, and despite being locked up, Laurie is convinced that Michael will return and continue what he started.
As I've said before, age 20 is one of my favorites in the entire series, so this is off to a promising start.
Rather than moving to a new town or changing her name, which honestly probably would have been the smarter thing to do, Laurie simply prepared for Michael's inevitable return by learning to shoot and making her house more secure and dangerous, which will come into play later on. Besides Laurie, the other standout character is her granddaughter, Allison, played by Andi Matichak, who is a secondary supporting character to Laurie. While she doesn't have as much to her character in this film, she definitely gets more development as the series goes on. One thing I absolutely love about all three of these movies is Michael's actor, James Jude Courtney. Not only does he have one of the best looks for Michael Myers in general, but his performance also is very solid. For me, he manages to strike a perfect balance between Nick Castle and Tyler Mane. He's not a hulky monster like he was in the Rob Zombie films, but he's not a pushover either. Either way you look at it, he's still aggressive, and this is one of the Michaels that I would not want to get into a fight with, especially with his kills counterpart. Speaking of kills, I'd say that overall they're pretty decent in this movie. Nothing really stands out as far as I'm concerned, but it gets the job done, and if anything, I think the way that they're shot makes them more gruesome to witness. I think the cinematography is also pretty great. When Michael dons his mask, there's an entire sequence that's done in a single take, which I assume was a callback to the Halloween from 1978, as the film did the same thing. It's probably one of the best looking Halloween films as a result, though you're free to disagree with me on that. I just think it was well done. One thing I also like about this film is that Laurie's trauma was taken in a much different direction than age 20. In that film, Laurie was paranoid and did what she could to stay away from Michael. She faked her own death, changed her name, and moved to a new state just to avoid him. In the 2018 counterpart, Laurie takes it a step further and is seemingly obsessed with killing Michael. Ultimately, I do prefer the age 20 version of Laurie, as I feel like that one is much more realistic, but it really comes down to personal preference here. Lastly, the film's showdown with Michael is pretty fun. It's intense, and I love how it makes some nods to the original. Instead of Michael being knocked off the balcony, it's Laurie this time. Michael goes to look over the balcony, and her body is suddenly gone, which makes that eerie sound that we're all too familiar with. Nothing crazy, just an observation, and I think it's a nice little switcheroo if anything. Finally, once Laurie and her family get the advantage on Michael and trap him in the basement, they don't take any chances and set the house on fire. The three make an escape on the back of a pickup truck, and the movie ends on a satisfying note. Well, at least it would have, but of course there are 2 more films after this. Before we get to kills, however, let's discuss some of the things that didn't work for me. For starters, some of the writing in this movie is just kind of bad. Which I know to some people is like, what, like bad writing in a horror movie, who cares? But in this movie, it sticks out like a sore thumb. There's Allison's dad, who is just a complete goofball, and he just completely takes me out of the scene. He's always making inappropriate jokes, and at one point even says this:
I got peanut butter on my penis.
I still struggle to believe that this is an actual line of dialogue that someone wrote, and then someone else had to come in and say, yeah, good enough.
Secondly, there's these 2 cops that are having lunch and making small talk. One of them just arbitrarily pulls out a sandwich and explains in great detail what's inside. Admittedly, they aren't as egregious as the cops in Halloween 5, but still, the idea that so much screen time was spent on them is really odd, and I wish they had used their screen time for more important things. Lastly, I have to talk about the Doctor we see throughout the film. With the absence of Donald Pleasance, I assumed at first that he would be our new Loomis. But that ends up not being the case, as we discover later on in the film that he actually was the one that allowed Michael to escape while being transferred. His reason being that he actually wanted to study Michael's evil and find out why he does what he does. We've already been down this path, movie. Please don't make that same mistake again. Overall, I find Halloween 2018 to be a fairly well done continuation. It has its issues, and some of the tension can be broken up by some of the really bad dialogue and whatnot. I think overall, if you actually are a fan of Halloween and even the original, it's a nice little decent continuation of that film. However, if you're into gore and love practical effects, just wait until we get to the next movie.
After watching Halloween Kills a couple of different times, I think I have found the perfect way to sum up this film.
Did you see me up there? I was killing, Jerry. Killing. Kill.
Halloween Kills, the sequel to Halloween 2018 and the second film in the new trilogy. It takes place immediately after the events of Halloween 2018, and we follow a group of townsfolk that aim to bring Michael's reign of terror to an end. However, he won't let up without a fight. And let me tell you, Michael is pissed off in this movie. There's a reason why it carries that title. This may end up being a shorter review compared to the rest, but I'll try to focus on the important aspects so as not to sound like a broken record. When talking about kills, it's important to mention that this film seems to prioritize 2 things. 1 is the kills, of course, and 2, the social commentary. First, we'll discuss the kills. It should come as no surprise, but if you don't count the 2 Rob Zombie films, this is easily the goriest Halloween film to date. And if you're a Halloween fan that prefers when it's more subtle and easy on the gore, you may be turned off by this installment for that reason alone. The film doesn't seem to take itself too seriously, so that's why I'm okay with it personally. If you're going to make the kills the focal point of your movie, then you need to deliver on them, and they certainly do. In the beginning, we see that Laurie's house is engulfed in flames and that firemen are sent out to put out the fire. Michael escapes and we get a good look at the mask, now severely burned, which is not only a cool look, but also conveys his burning anger throughout the film. I also like that the mask has more of an identity in this movie. At one point it's taken from Michael, who rushes to get it back. It's heavily implied that it gives him a source of power in this movie, and also that he feels vulnerable without it. He then takes one of the firemen's tools and kills every single one of them, all while the house is burning down behind them. Even with all my problems with this movie, I can't deny that this sequence alone is just awesome. Honestly, it's really hard to choose a favorite kill as there are many standouts. Instead of showing all of them, I'll list a few favorites. For starters, there's a woman who gets a broken bulb in her throat. There's a guy that gets his eyes gouged out, very gruesome, I love it. Or in the case of Allison's boyfriend, he gets his head twisted backwards. Whether you love it or hate it, this film has a lot of variety in its kills, so it gets brownie points for that alone. Though I do like the burning house sequence, my favorite scene in the entire film actually is done through a flashback. It jumps back to Halloween night of 1978 and attempts to explain in this timeline how Michael got apprehended. This scene is just simply awesome. The way that it's colored corrected to look like the original is so well done. If they were to ever make another Halloween film, which I feel like is going to be likely at this point, I hope it looks and feels similar to this sequence. Either way, two officers are looking inside the Myers house for a lead on Michael himself, and he eventually does pop in to strangle one of them. The other officer tries to threaten Michael with shooting him, but ultimately shoots his partner by accident. Michael goes back downstairs, and we're greeted by the police and Dr. Samuel Loomis, though it's obviously not Donald Pleasance this time around. He was instead played by Tom Jones Jr., and the voice was done by a guy named Colin Mahan. It should go without saying, but this is a nearly spot-on impersonation. The first time I saw this, I sat up in my chair confused because I legitimately thought it was actually Donald Pleasance the first time I saw it. This was a great scene and arguably the best part of Kills in my opinion. The rest of the movie is honestly not all that great. Not saying it's bad, but it leans more into the social commentary aspect by the end, and I'm not really that big a fan of it. Michael has brought so much terror to Haddonfield that he creates a mob, sort of like in Halloween 4, but with even more town members. They all want to kill Michael and go out of their way to do so, even if it means inadvertently injuring others and accusing a disabled man of being Michael Myers, which leads to him jumping off the roof to the hospital. And this is easily my biggest criticism of the movie, the social commentary. Now, you can absolutely do social commentary in a horror movie, and if it's done well, it can add an extra layer of depth to the film. However, the mob gets way too much attention, and they're not exactly subtle about it.
Evil dies tonight!
And trust me, you'll hear this line a lot more as it goes on. It will be beaten into your head relentlessly.
I get what they're trying to do by saying that mob mentality can be dangerous for its community, but this movie just shoves it down your throat.
Now he's turning us into monsters.
Personally, I think they handle the social commentary much better in Halloween Ends, but we'll get to that soon. With all that said, I don't think Halloween Kills is all that bad. The dialogue is where it really falters the most. It's cheesy and really forced at times, making it hard to take anything the characters do seriously. I didn't get to talk about her very much, but another disappointing aspect is that Laurie is hardly present throughout the film. In fact, she gets more screen time in the original Halloween 2 despite being injured in both films. That being said, the ending is one hell of a cliffhanger, with Laurie suggesting that she and Michael will have one final showdown before the series is over. So yeah, Kills isn't great, but it's not bad either. The highlight of the film revolves around some great kills and a few good sequences, but overall I can do without the rest of the movie. Without further ado, let's move on to the final installment of the Halloween trilogy, and see how they end the series. Halloween Ends was released in 2022 and is the latest installment in the Halloween saga. Again, I say latest because I believe that at some point we're going to get more Halloween films, but that's besides the point. To say that this movie is mixed is an understatement. This film is both loved and hated for many different reasons by different people, and I can understand the sentiment from both sides. Which one do I fall into though? Let's discuss it and find out. So the film opens on Halloween night 2018. We're introduced to one of the main characters, Corey, who's babysitting for the evening while the parents go to a Halloween party. Everything seems to be pretty normal, and the entire time you're expecting Michael to pop up, but that never actually happens. Instead, the kid plays a prank on Corey by locking him inside of a closet. Corey is obviously frightened and kicks open the door in retaliation. However, this results in a freak accident where the kid falls over the railing and is killed, which is just one hell of an opening. We jump to Laurie and Allison as they're now living together. Laurie has seemingly given up on pursuing Michael because, after all, he hasn't been seen in almost 4 years. So instead, she decides to write about her experience regarding him, hoping that will give her some kind of closure she needs in order to move on. So, this off the bat is an immediate red flag, and I get why many fans were disappointed by this decision, especially after Kill's cliffhanger ending. Of course, that's not the only issue regarding this movie, oh no, but we'll get to them as we go. For right now, all you need to know is that the townsfolk of Haddonfield have turned on Corey, as they still blame him for the child's death. Even when he was proven innocent in court, this doesn't seem to matter because the citizens of Haddonfield still harass him on a daily basis, and sometimes are even aggressive towards him. While this is a fairly interesting angle to take the series in, I do think that it's kind of jarring that they decided to do it in the last movie in the trilogy. I'm not saying this would have failed no matter what the writers did, or maybe if they even decided to do it as like a halfway movie, but I think if they had introduced Corey early on in the series, it could have maybe been a lot better and the transition would have probably made more sense. And I know many will say that the film by default isn't good because Michael is barely in it, and I can understand that criticism. However, Michael was severely beaten in kills, and I guess he needed time to recover, so that's why he's probably not as present as he could have been. Obviously, he's very weakened in this movie, and so he actually transfers some of his evil into Corey. Now, this was a concept that was introduced at the end of Halloween 4, but it just ultimately never went anywhere. For the longest time, everyone in Haddonfield is saying Corey is an evil child murderer, despite being innocent. So now, with the influence of Michael's evil, and the pressure from the townsfolk, he became the very thing that they made him into. I know this will get me into some hot water, but I don't actually mind this idea as a whole. Despite not being as developed as it could have been, I think that's what makes this scary. Without Michael's presence, the townsfolk have to identify a new evil, which is now Corey. This is what I mean when I say the mob mentality works a lot better in this movie than it does in Kills. The townsfolk are much more believable this time around, and I do believe that they actually would lash out like this. So let's go ahead and jump into the ending, as that's what many are curious about. Corey up until this point has been committing murder on Michael's behalf in order to build him up again. So when Corey is eventually killed, Michael and Laurie have their final battle, which is pretty nail-biting and intense. Ultimately, Michael is cut up and eventually bleeds to death. But just to be on the safe side, the townsfolk gather at a junkyard where they toss Michael's body into a crusher.
Which, if I'm being honest, I don't actually see him coming back from that one, unless of course his body parts start acting autonomously and they start giving the middle finger like they did in Evil Dead.
So yeah, Laurie finishes her memoir and is able to finally find peace from the boogeyman. I know I'll miss some details and I can't dissect every piece of the film simply due to time restraints, but let's go ahead and discuss the verdict. Halloween Ends, for better or worse, is a very flawed film. Not only a flawed film, but a very flawed Halloween film. It's not satisfying or as developed as I would like it to be, and not to mention the ending of Kills implied that it would be a much, much different film. And while I'm not someone that hates the movie or the ideas presented, I 100% understand why many do hate this film. It introduces new characters into the mix, and ultimately, Michael takes a backseat in his own movie. Now, it's possible that this movie had to be rewritten or restructured in some ways because this was made around the same time that COVID-19 was still on the uprise, but I'm sure many didn't expect the plot to be exactly like this. I appreciate the efforts to try something new even if it didn't work out, but I can't bring myself to say that I do hate this movie. For me, that title still goes to either Halloween 5 or Resurrection. Ends is really flawed, don't get me wrong, but both those movies are just so soulless and boring that it leaves me tired by the end. At least with Ends I can say I enjoyed some aspects. During the events of the movie, Allison and Corey form a bond over their past trauma, and while it may not feel earned by the audience members, I think this is simply a case of two people who are able to come together over similar experiences. It's not healthy, but I think that was the point the filmmakers were trying to make. We all know that Corey is going down a dark path and is dragging Allison along with him, but when the townsfolk have already turned against them, then yeah, I can see why they'd be together. They can pretty much only trust each other at that point. As always, Jamie Lee Curtis does a good job in the role, and she does get more screen time in this compared to Kills, but I have to say, some of her lines in this movie are just plain awful.
That makes you want to rip off your shirt and show Grief your fucking tits and say, you know what, let's go.
This just feels like a line that Linda or Annie would say from the original film, except that this is coming from Laurie, which just makes it sound odd.
So let's go ahead and wrap up my thoughts on Ends. It's an ambitious, albeit underwhelming ending to the series that has some promising ideas but doesn't really know what to do with them. And when it's all said and done, it leaves behind a feeling of disappointment. I don't hate Ends, and in some cases prefer it over Halloween 2018 and Kills, but I have to admit that those films are at least more focused and know what they actually are trying to do. The one thing that I can say about Ends is that it's ambitious, but that doesn't always translate to quality. But who knows, maybe we'll see a new set of Halloween films one day. The rights are no longer at Blumhouse, and who's to say that they won't do another reboot of sorts in the future. And while I prefer for some time to pass before we got word of another film, I'd be interested to see what they have in store for the Boogeyman. Well, I've been recording this for a while now, and while I've had my fun, I'm happy to say that it's over. The Halloween series was definitely an interesting series to go through, and thankfully I enjoyed more entries than I thought I would. But be sure to look out for both my ranking of the movies as well as the Michael Myers portrayals and looks.
Normally I wouldn't ask this of my subscribers or my audience because I feel like it comes off as begging sometimes, but I did spend a lot of time actually making this video, so if you guys did enjoy it and want to see more, consider liking or subscribing. And hell, if you guys actually want to take it a step further, consider supporting me on my Ko-fi, which is linked down below in the description. Anything that you tip me will be put back into the videos in some way, shape, or form, whether it's buying new equipment or buying a film to review. But no matter what you do, I want you guys to know that I appreciate your time and just thank you for watching my videos at all. It truly, truly means the world to me, so just thank you very much. With all that said, guys, this has been my review of the Halloween series as a whole. Like I said, if you have any thoughts or opinions about my video or the Halloween series altogether, I'd like to know what you have to say, so put them down below in the comments. And until next time, guys, this has been ThatGuyMatt, and I will see you guys all next time. I hope you all take care.